The story begins not with missiles, speeches, or dramatic headlines, but with a single document. When Washington and Tehran signed what became known as the Islamabad Memorandum, media outlets rushed to describe it as a breakthrough, a peace agreement, a ceasefire, and the first real step away from months of dangerous confrontation. But reading the memorandum carefully tells a far more complicated story. The language inside doesn't resemble an agreement reached by two sides negotiating from equal positions. Instead, it reads more like a temporary arrangement created because one side had reached a point where continuing the conflict carried greater risks than accepting difficult compromises. This isn't about claiming that Iran achieved an overwhelming military victory over the United States. Few serious analysts would argue that. The more important issue lies somewhere far less dramatic, yet potentially far more significant: energy. More specifically, the availability of the specialized fuels that keep military aircraft flying, freight moving across the country, and supply chains functioning every day. At the time the agreement was announced, officials quietly acknowledged something that received surprisingly little public attention. According to the administration's own assessment, the United States had only a limited number of weeks remaining before a particular category of fuel supply became critically strained. For the world's largest economy and most powerful military, that's an extraordinary statement. It immediately raises an obvious question. How could a nation with enormous oil production suddenly face concerns over fuel availability? The answer begins with a fact many people overlook. Not every barrel of crude oil is the same. Oil varies enormously depending on where it comes from. Some crude is light, containing relatively low sulfur levels. Other varieties are much heavier and contain significantly more sulfur compounds. These differences are not minor technical details. They determine exactly how refineries process oil and what products can ultimately be produced from it. For decades, countries around the Persian Gulf have supplied large volumes of heavy sour crude to international markets. This type of oil represents a substantial share of global production and has played an essential role in supplying industrial economies. Meanwhile, most domestic American production consists primarily of lighter, sweeter crude. Although both are classified simply as crude oil, they behave very differently inside a refinery. That distinction matters because America's largest refining complexes, especially those located along the Gulf Coast, weren't designed around light domestic production. Over many decades, billions of dollars were invested to optimize those facilities for processing heavier imported crude. Changing that system isn't as simple as ordering different shipments. Think about the difference between a gasoline engine and a diesel engine. Both are engines, both power vehicles. Yet putting gasoline into a diesel vehicle or diesel into a gasoline vehicle doesn't simply reduce efficiency. It can cause severe mechanical damage because each system is engineered around a completely different fuel. Refineries operate under similar limitations. Their equipment, processing units, and chemical systems are configured for very specific feedstocks. Replacing one crude type with another isn't something operators can accomplish overnight. As tensions in the Gulf disrupted normal shipping routes during the early stages of the conflict, the effects weren't immediately visible. Existing cargoes had already departed. Dozens of tankers were already crossing the oceans, carrying previously purchased supplies toward American ports. For several weeks, those deliveries continued arriving as scheduled, creating the impression that supplies remained stable. But those shipments represented the final wave of oil loaded before maritime disruptions intensified. Eventually, that floating inventory reached its destination. Once the last cargoes were unloaded, the hidden buffer that had protected the market quietly disappeared. Only then did policymakers begin confronting the full reality of the supply challenge. Interestingly, the growing political urgency surrounding ceasefire negotiations closely matched the timeline of those final deliveries. Whether that timing was coincidence or necessity remains open to debate. But the overlap is difficult to ignore. Once the reserve provided by those incoming shipments disappeared, there were very few immediate alternatives capable of replacing the specific grades of crude American refineries required. From that point onward, the discussion was no longer centered only on diplomacy. It became equally about logistics, industrial capacity, and the hard physical realities of energy. The challenge becomes even clearer once you look at what heavy crude is actually used to produce. When most people hear the phrase oil shortage, they immediately think about gasoline prices. But gasoline isn't necessarily the first concern for governments during a geopolitical crisis. The real priority is what refiners call middle distillates. These are the fuels that power the backbone of a modern economy. Diesel keeps long-haul trucks moving across interstate highways. It fuels freight trains transporting raw materials and consumer goods. Agricultural equipment depends on it during planting and harvest seasons. Construction machinery, emergency generators, and countless industrial operations rely on the same fuel every single day. Then there's aviation fuel. Commercial airlines cannot operate without it. Cargo aircraft transporting critical supplies require enormous quantities of it. More importantly, every sustained military air operation depends on a reliable flow of jet fuel. Without those fuels, supply chains begin slowing long before ordinary consumers notice anything unusual. Store shelves don't empty overnight. Instead, transportation becomes more expensive, deliveries take longer, and industries begin competing for increasingly limited supplies. That gradual pressure eventually spreads throughout the economy. This explains why heavy sour crude carries such strategic importance. A significant portion of every barrel processed through specialized refineries becomes these middle distillate products. Losing access to that feedstock doesn't simply reduce total oil availability. It specifically threatens the fuels that keep transportation networks and military logistics functioning. Faced with that possibility, policymakers turn toward one of the few emergency options available: the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. For decades, the reserve has existed as an insurance policy against severe disruptions in global energy markets. Millions of barrels of crude have been stored underground, with the expectation that they would only be used during extraordinary circumstances. As supply pressures increased, those emergency reserves reportedly began flowing into the market at a rapid pace. The objective wasn't to permanently solve the problem, it was to buy time. Every barrel released delayed the moment when shortages might begin affecting refineries and fuel distributors. But every emergency reserve has one unavoidable limitation. Eventually, it runs lower. If withdrawals continue faster than replacements arrive, the reserve transforms from a long-term safety net into a countdown clock. Analysts watching inventory levels began calculating how long that pace could realistically continue. Using publicly available figures, many estimated that the available supply provided only a limited operating window before inventories would reach uncomfortable levels. That estimate aligned remarkably closely with the timeline discussed by government officials when they warned about several weeks of remaining supply. Whether intentional or not, those separate timelines appeared to converge. The reserve wasn't eliminating the underlying issue, it was temporarily masking it. Meanwhile, another complication emerged. Although shipments gradually resumed leaving the Persian Gulf after the memorandum was signed, global energy markets had already begun adjusting to new realities. Instead of returning to previous trading patterns, many cargoes reportedly headed toward Asian buyers: China, India, Japan, South Korea. These countries continued purchasing available supplies, redirecting a substantial portion of exports away from previous destinations. That meant reopening shipping lanes alone didn't automatically restore earlier supply chains. Even if more oil was moving again, it wasn't necessarily moving toward American refineries. As a result, the agreement celebrated as a diplomatic breakthrough didn't instantly resolve the logistical challenge facing domestic fuel markets. Diplomatic tensions may have eased, shipping activity may have partially recovered, but refinery economics operate according to contracts, transportation schedules, infrastructure limitations, and geography, not political headlines. Even under the most optimistic conditions, a tanker leaving Gulf ports still requires weeks before reaching North American terminals. After arrival, the crude must be unloaded, inspected, transported into refinery systems, processed, and finally distributed through pipelines before becoming usable fuel. None of those steps happen overnight. The physical supply chain follows its own timetable regardless of political announcements. That reality leaves markets facing an uncomfortable question. Have investors fully accounted for these risks? Financial markets often react before problems become visible. Other times, they remain surprisingly calm until one critical event forces everyone to reassess conditions simultaneously. History has shown examples of both. If concerns surrounding specialized fuel supplies ultimately prove overstated, markets may continue operating normally. But if the underlying logistical constraints are as significant as some analysts believe, today's stability could simply represent the quiet period before a much sharper adjustment. And that's precisely why the actual wording inside the memorandum deserves closer examination. Because while public attention focused on speeches and press conferences, the legal language inside the agreement may reveal far more about what each side expected to happen next than the political messaging surrounding it. Infrastructure.